Thanks for inviting me. So in the music business, usually the opening act goes before the main attraction, but in academia, for some reason, it's the opposite. But I will try to do a good job. So let me talk you through some work. This is also very recent. A working paper came out 2 weeks ago, and I only presented it once before. But it's together with David Robinson at Duke University. And what we're interested in is, oops. Wow. Is that me? What psychologists call stress management.
The pre-mortem would have anticipated pressing the wrong button.
Exactly. So maybe I can get some help here to get my presentation going. So it's about metacognition. So thinking about what people know and what they don't know. So people, psychologists like to categorize these people into 3 groups. So you have those who know what they know, so they have high knowledge and thus make informed decisions. And then you have the category who know that they don't know, so they realize they know little and need some help to decide. And then we have the somewhat more problematic group, namely those who don't know that they don't know. They don't realize their lack of competence, so they're thus open to make mistakes. And we argue that we think a choice architecture with default options generally works well for the 2 first categories, but the third one has not been discussed so much. And our paper is then about establishing a link between actual retirement choices in Sweden and this 3rd category. Now, so what inspired us in this work was that we had a survey made at LinkedIn in the US of people in the ages 25 to 65, and we're asking this question, if past returns are more important than fees. And we were a little bit surprised by these results because, as you can see, 25% don't know. And then the majority actually agree that past returns are really important, despite all the effort the SEC has put into informing people about the importance of fees. And remember, this sample here is mostly consisting of white-collar senior executives with very high incomes and education. So this inspired us to go to Sweden. Or I should say also another disadvantage with this study was that we couldn't link these results to actual choices, but this we could do in Sweden. So that's what we did. We asked Swedes the same question, and we more or less got the same results here. And this might also be a little bit surprising because in Sweden, general financial literacy is high. And as Richard Thaler pointed out, this system of premium pension choices has been going on now for almost 17 years. Now, I'm not going to argue that there is no merit to considering past returns, but I mean, here we're not surveying financial economists here. These are more likely to be bus drivers and nurses. And secondly, given the data that we have, we can see that more than half of the people that make an active choice are actually just stuck with the same fund throughout. So it's a little bit puzzling that so many people put weight on past returns, because you would think, like a financial economist, that if you want to apply momentum strategies, you should be very active, right? So our survey then was conducted or administered through Statistics Sweden. So we asked 12,000 Swedes to participate. And we measure financial knowledge or financial literacy, but we also test self-awareness, so trying to assess what people know. And then we match it to registry data. So we have the standard stuff with education and income, but we also have data from the premium pension agency of the complete histories. And we also have some data on coordinated changes, which we would then use as a proxy for advisor activities. I will come back to that later. So we got something like 2,008 responses of this survey, which we think was pretty good. And we're left with something like 2,500 observations once we've done all this matching. Now, how do we solicit knowledge? Well, we take the off-the-shelf financial literacy test developed by Anna Maria Lusardi and Olivia Mitchell. They talk about the big three. The big three is about compounding, inflation, and diversification. And compounding is essentially realizing that you have more than $102 if you leave $100 in the bank at a 2% interest rate and let it grow for 5%, at a 5% interest rate. Inflation is about realizing that you have less to spend if inflation is higher than the interest rate. And diversification is about realizing that an equity mutual fund is a safer investment than a single equity. I don't have a point here, I think, but if you have sharp eyes, you see the responses here, and most Swedes got these questions right. Now, in the US, at the National Financial Capability Study, they include 2 other questions. One of them is about mortgages, which is typically something that we don't have in Sweden. So we opted to have this question about savings instead, which we think is relevant for pension choices. So namely, what is the required rate of return in order to double your money over 10 years? And here you can see that only 43% realized that that rate of return is lower than 10%. And only 5% actually responded that they didn't know. Now the 5th question is about bond pricing. Again, that's an off-the-shelf question from the NFCS. And it's about realizing that there's an inverse relationship between the interest rate and the bond price. And when I talked to Anna Maria about it, essentially why you put it there is just to have some kind of indicator if someone's taken a finance class. Okay, so these are the questions, and it's standard. But the novel thing that we do, we ask a 6th question. So we ask people to put in a probability that they have 5 correct, 4 correct, 3 correct, etc. So this allows us to make 2 things. First, we can define something that we call a perceived score. That's just a simple weighted average of the probabilities you put in these boxes, a point estimate. And the other one is something that we can call precision. So we can measure how tight this probability distribution is, so how sure you are about your response. So both of these concepts are closely related to overconfidence and how to think about that. Now, the results. So it looks like this. So we plot the average probability distribution across score. So to the horizontal right axis are the actual score categories. And then for every score category, we plot the probability distributions. And there are a couple of things to note here, which I think are interesting. You see there are pointy peaks at the 5 category and the 0 category. So if you have full score, so if you know this test, that indicates that these people know what they know, right? On the other extreme, for the people who scored 0, they have a peak at 0. So these people, they know that they don't know, right? But what I think is more striking about this picture is that the probability distributions are very flat in these categories. So these people, they don't know what they know, okay? Another way of viewing these results is just to take the average of these probability distributions, that's the perceived score, and we plot it against the actual score. And that would look like this. And what you can see here is then you have a dotted line here, that's a 45-degree line. So if people would be perfectly calibrated, the black line, solid line, would be completely on the 45-degree line, making a perfect mapping of what you think you know and what you know. But this is not what we see. We typically see that people with lower scores, they tend to overestimate what they know. And the people who have high scores, they are pretty well calibrated. Sorry. So, now, going back to metacognition, another way to think about that is the propensity to be dead sure. So say that you put 100% probability in one of these boxes, then you're dead sure. And we can sort those people across scores as well. That's the bars here in this graph. So if you look at the people in the fifth category, those with full scores, they are a little bit more likely to be dead sure. They're also most often correct about it. Now, if you go down on this scale and look at people with lower scores, the propensity to be dead sure is actually more or better associated with being wrong rather than right. So what psychologists would say is that confidence does not decay with competence. So, and what we do then is that we try to link these results to thinking fees or past returns are important. So in the same graph, now we were plotting the responses of thinking fees or past returns are more important. And if you eyeball this a little bit, I think you can see that having these opinion about fees are better explained by knowledge itself. And the red bars are the responses for thinking past returns are important. And those are actually better explained by perceived score rather than actual score. And we don't only eyeball this in the paper, we do actually some econometric tests. And what you can see is that the self-perception completely crowds out the effect of knowledge when you're looking at the past return people. So in other words, having the view or having a strong view that past returns is really important for selecting mutual funds is better explained by confidence rather than competence. That's our first result, and that's basically only based on the survey. Now, we connect this to registry data and pension fund data, and we look at the propensity to stick into the default fund. And these bars here also show the results of the literacy test. So people who the people who don't know, they're much more likely to stay with the default. Almost half of the respondents in this group stays in the default, whereas that is much lower for the two other categories. Now you see that the score for financial literacy is also very low for the don't knows. So you're easily led to believe that what's going on here is just that people who are less literate are the ones that fall into this category. But you have to be careful here because there's many things at play here, and socio-demographics explains a lot of this propensity. So when we do this formally, this is a nasty table, I realize that. But if you look here, once you control for a bunch of other stuff, financial literacy itself has zero explanatory power of the propensity to stick with the default fund, whereas the much more domain-specific question about mutual funds has a lot of power when it comes to explaining these propensities. So what this says is that if you don't know what is important in explaining the performance of a mutual fund going forward, it says that you're 15% more likely to be in the default fund. And if you think that past returns are really important, you're actually more likely to opt out of the default fund. We also asked a bunch of questions of household planning and perceptions in other domains of finance. And what the first thing that strikes you here, I think, is that people who don't know, they are much less interested in finance in general. They are much less likely to plan for retirement. That's the gray bars here. And they have somewhat a more negative economic outlook. So one way to think about this is that it's not only that they don't know, they actually don't care. Right? That's one interpretation. So, and the other two groups, if you look at the fee people are much more likely to be interested in finance. But what struck us was that people who responded that past returns are important are really much more open to receiving free financial advice. So now in Sweden, as most of you would know, we had this new entrants coming into the market selling quite expensive financial advice, and you have this sort of mass market, mass changes going on. So we asked our colleagues, Magnus Dahlqvist, who I noticed left now in my presentation, I've noted that, and Paul Söderlind and Jose Martinez, they had a much bigger set of pensioners. They have 500,000 people. And we wanted to look then at coordinated changes. So coordinated change is that you make a choice of a specific or a selection of choices the very same day as a lot of other people. Okay, and that's a coordinated change, and that would be an indicator of being associated with one of these advisory services, right? Now, it's a little bit of an empirical question, how many simultaneous choices that needs to go on here in order to be classified as belonging to an advisor. I will come back to that, but this graph shows you, and in one of our definitions, that as much as 70 to 80% of all the transactions within the system could be attributed to these coordinated changes. And this eventually became problematic for the PPA. So they decided to change the interface in late 2011, making it much more difficult for advisors to make changes on behalf of their customers. As you can see, after this dotted line, you see that this activity sort of dies off. Now, we're not going to say that advice is bad. It's just that we want to pick up this effect and see if these past returns people would be more susceptible to this type of services that is being sold to them. Typically, the services that we're after are those that are more expensive and sort of a mass market character. So what we do, we try a couple of different specifications. So at the lowest level we consider here is like 1,000 simultaneous trades, and then we look at the lower quartile that would be associated with 3,000 trades in one day. And then at the median, that's over 12,000 identical trades the same day. And what we think is interesting here is that the past return people, they seem to be much more likely to be associated with these more mass changes. So how do you interpret this? Well, one way to interpret this is that they are more likely to be customers with the bigger firms, the more successful advisory firms. Another interpretation is also that the reason why they do this is that these firms are typically more aggressive firms, right? So if this is correct, we thought that we could make another test. So after this change in 2011, many of the bigger firms, more successful advisory firms, they opted to start their own fund-in-fund solutions. So they would steer their customers into their own funds. And these funds are named, they're in a white paper from the PPA. So we know which one there are. So we can test what the probability would be to be a customer in one of these funds at the end of 2015, when our sample ends. And what you can see here is that, you know, in the lower levels of, so first of all, what you can see is that having the perception that past returns are really important increases the probability of 6% that you're going to be a customer in one of these advisory-led funds. Now, when we introduce our different definitions of what we think makes you being part of one of these advisor or associated with one of these advisory firms, increases the probability dramatic, and in fact, this also crowds out this effect of having the beliefs. So reading the numbers here, it tells you that in our classification of being associated with having financial advice or mass market financial advice increases the probability of 50% that you're going to be stuck in one of these funds at the end of 2015. Right. Now, of course, so it could be the other way around, obviously. So this is not causality, I would say. So it could be that these more successful or aggressive funds would also be the ones who influence investors. I mean, it might be the case that they would have an incentive to say that fees are not so important, you should really look at past returns. But we think that both of these hypotheses are equally as interesting. Now, looking at fees, so we find that being associated with one of these advisory funds is associated with paying something like 6 basis points higher fees. Having the belief that past returns are really important is associated with 3 basis points higher fees. Now, you could say that these are low numbers, but as Richard Taylor just mentioned, the default fund has a fee of 14 basis points. So from that perspective, these are quite considerable numbers, I would say. But finally, it could be the fact that I can have the view that past returns are really important. I can also hire, investment advisors, and I can pay higher fees. That could be rational if I perform better as well. We have to look at that and also rule out that these investors do better. So in the final part of our analysis, we look at performance. We do it in many ways in the paper, but this is just one way to look at it. And what we find is actually the opposite. So having the belief that past returns are really important is actually associated with a lower performance of something like 30 to 40 basis points per year, which is quite substantial. And having an advisor is about 70 to 80 or 90 basis points. So these people are actually underperforming the market. Now, there's a caveat here, and I think that previous speaker also touched upon that. If you look closely in this graph and look at the people who don't know, they're actually outperforming. Now, I would take this as a grain of salt, but because, as I already showed you, these people are much more likely to go with the default fund, right? So there are two things at play here. But nevertheless, I think our results do highlight that the people who choose advisors and have sort of misguided beliefs about returns and mutual funds in particular suffer from their performance. Now, how do I summarize this paper? I think that we have a very easy, an easy message to convey here. And I looked around, and I think it's already been said by Mark Twain. So it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. Thanks.